An old man stands over a slab of pale desert rock, a worn wooden staff gripped in his fist. It is the same staff that once split a sea in two, and in a moment he is going to raise it and bring it down on the stone. He is not a coward. He has stared down the most powerful man on earth. He is not a stranger to God. He has spoken with him face to face, the way a person speaks with a friend. He is the meekest man on the face of the earth, the one who led a nation out of slavery through 40 years of sand and hunger and rebellion. And he is about to lose the one thing he has walked all that way to reach, not because he ran, not because he doubted, because of what he is about to do with that staff. Two words spoken to a stone. One command remembered wrong. A staff brought down twice when a voice raised once would have been enough. And the man who carried an entire people to the edge of their home will die within sight of the border and never set foot across it. One strike. That is what it came down to. One strike of a staff in the 40th year, undoing the last steps of the longest walk in the whole Bible. You have probably been told the story this way. Moses lost his temper. He got angry with the people. He lashed out, and God punished him for it. That is what most of us grew up hearing. But that is not what the text actually says. The sin was quieter than anger and far more serious. It would be like an employee fired not for shouting in the office, but for signing his own name where the owner's name belonged. A small motion, an enormous line crossed. So what really happened at that rock? Why would a single blow of a staff cancel 40 years of faithfulness? And why does God, when he hands down the sentence, never once mention anger? To understand what went wrong at the second rock, you have to go back to the first one. Because there was an earlier rock, 40 years before, in another desert, with the very same problem. And what God told Moses to do that day is the key to everything. Let us start there. The first time Israel had no water, God told Moses to hit the rock. The second time, that same instruction would cost him the promised land. To see why, we have to watch the first rock closely, because Moses never forgot it. Go back to the very beginning of the wilderness, only weeks after the sea closed over Pharaoh's army. The people have come to a place called Rephidim, and there is no water, not a low well, not a muddy stream, nothing. And a whole nation with children and flocks and herds is standing in the heat with dry throats, watching their leader. They turn on Moses fast. The book of Exodus says they quarreled with him. Give us water to drink, they say. Moses answers, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But they are past listening. They are thirsty, and thirst makes people cruel. They grumble against him and say, in chapter 17, verse 3, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? And Moses cries out to God and says, in chapter 17, verse 4, what am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me. That is where things stand. A leader, a mob, and no water. And then God speaks, and what he tells Moses to do is the detail that matters for the rest of this entire story. God says, in chapter 17, verse 6, I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. Strike the rock, hit it. Take that staff in your hand, the staff that came down on the Nile and turned a river to blood, the staff you stretched over the sea until it split, and bring it down on the stone. So Moses did. He struck the rock in front of the elders of Israel, and water came pouring out, enough for a nation and all their animals to drink. Then Moses names the place. And the name he chooses is one to hold on to, because it comes back. He calls it Massa and Meribah. Massa means testing. Meribah means quarreling. He says in chapter 17, verse 7, he named it that because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Sit with that word for a second. Meribah, quarreling, because a second place is going to carry almost the same name, 40 years and a lifetime later. And when it does, everything will look the same on the surface. The same desert, the same dry throats, the same nation shouting the same complaint, the same leader with the same staff in his hand. But one thing will be different, and Moses will miss it. Here's what that first rock did to a man. If you have ever driven the same road to work every day for years, you know your hands turn the wheel before your mind decides to. You do not read the signs anymore, you just drive it. Moses had a command stored in his body now, worn smooth like a path walked 1,000 times. Water problem, angry people, God says act. And the action, the one his hand remembered, was to strike. That memory saved a nation once. And 40 years later, it would keep him out of the land. Because of the generation standing at Rephidim, the ones who drank from that first rock do not make it home. Over the next 4 decades, they die in the sand, one by one, an entire generation buried in the wilderness for their unbelief. And their children grow up on the move, born between camps, raised on manna, until they finally arrive at the edge of another desert with the same cracked lips their parents had. And leading them, still, is the same old man. Older now, wearier, carrying a command in his hands that worked the last time. The problem is that this time, God is going to change it. His sister is dead. Miriam, the girl who once stood on the bank of the Nile and watched a basket float toward Pharaoh's daughter, the woman who led the dancing after the sea split, is buried in the sand at his feet. There's no time to grieve, because the well is dry again, and a whole nation is screaming at him again, the same scream he has been hearing for 40 years. This is Kadesh, in the desert of Zin. The book of Numbers tells us Miriam died there and was buried there in one short sentence and then moves straight to the crisis. There was no water for the community, and they gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. Listen to how they talk to him. If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord, they say. And then, in chapter 20, verse 4, why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. It is the same complaint. Word for word, almost, the complaint their parents made at the first rock. Different desert, same throats, same rage, and an old man who has heard it his entire adult life. Moses and Aaron do the right thing first. They walk away from the crowd, go to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and fall face down. And the glory of the Lord appears to them. This is the picture to hold. Two brothers, both past their prime, both bone-tired, faces in the dust before God, while a nation shouts behind them. And out of that glory, God gives a command, a new command. Here it is, in chapter 20, verse 8. Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink. Take the staff, but speak to the rock. Do you hear what changed? 40 years ago, at the first rock, the command was strike it. Now, at the second rock, the command is speak to it. Bring the staff, yes. Hold the symbol of God's power in your hand, yes. But this time, do not swing it. This time, just speak, and the stone will hear the word of God and open. That is the instruction. Now watch what Moses actually does. He takes the staff from the Lord's presence, just as commanded. So far, so good. He and Aaron gather the people in front of the rock, and then Moses opens his mouth, and here's what comes out in chapter 20, verse 10. Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Stop on those words, because 2 things just went wrong in a single sentence. First, listen, you rebels. 40 years of patience, and here at the end it cracks. But the deeper problem is the next word. Must we bring you water out of this rock? We. Not must the Lord bring you water, not watch what God will do. We. As if the water were his to give. As if he and Aaron and not God were the source standing behind that stone. And then he raises his arm, and he strikes the rock, not once, twice. The old motion, the one his body remembered, the one that worked the last time. Arm up, staff down. Arm up, staff down. So 2 blows on a stone that God only asked him to talk to. And here is the part that makes the whole thing ache. The water came anyway. Verse 11, water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. God did not punish the people. He did not let them go thirsty to make a point about their leader. The miracle happened. The stone poured. A nation drank its fill and their animals with them. And none of them in that moment probably had any idea that something enormous had just gone wrong. Because it had. This was not a leader losing his cool and getting a slap on the wrist. Think of it this way. A trusted manager stands in front of the whole company and announces a decision as if it were his own, taking the credit that belonged to the owner who actually made the call. The words are small, the breach is not, and the higher you stand, the shorter the fall. So let us take stock of where we are. There was a first rock, and God said, "Strike it." And Moses struck it, and that was obedience. There's now a second rock, and God said, "Speak to it." And Moses struck it twice and said, "We?" And that was something else entirely. The water still came. God's mercy did not depend on Moses getting it right. If this is helping you see this story in a way you have not seen it before, take a second to subscribe and share it with someone who has only ever heard that Moses just lost his temper. There's more here than that, and the rest of it is where it gets personal. Because the real weight of this is not in what Moses did. It is in what God says next. And there is one word in God's sentence that tells you exactly what this was about. There's one word in God's sentence that tells you exactly what went wrong. And it is not the word you would expect. It is not rebels. It is not even we. It is a word about God himself. Here's the verdict spoken directly to Moses and Aaron in chapter 20, verse 12. Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. Read that again slowly, because every piece of it matters. Not because you got angry, not because you hit the rock instead of talking to it, though he did. The reason God gives is this: you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites. The sin has a name, and the name is not temper. The name is holiness. Moses failed to treat God as holy in front of the people. That is the charge. So let us take it apart, because there are really three things tangled together in that one moment at the rock, and God's sentence gathers all of them under that single heading. The first is the word "we." Must we bring you water out of this rock? In that one syllable, Moses stepped in front of God. For a breath, the water was his gift, not God's. And a leader who takes the credit that belongs to God has, in that instant, stopped pointing people to God and started pointing them to himself. The second is the striking. God said, "Speak," Moses struck. It is not that hitting a rock is worse than talking to one. It is that God had given a specific word, and Moses substituted his own memory for God's instruction. He did what had worked before instead of what he had just been told. And the third is the part that makes both of the others so heavy. In the sight of the Israelites, before their eyes. A leader is a mirror. Everything he does, the whole nation sees and reads and learns from. When Moses stood in front of them and struck and said, "We," he taught a watching people something false about God in the very act of giving them a gift from God. Now here's where honesty matters. Christians have argued for centuries about which of these three was really the sin. Some say it was the striking, the plain disobedience. Some say it was the word "we," the theft of glory. Some say it was the anger underneath it all. Some say it was the whole knot together, impossible to pull apart. And the truth is, the text does not hand us a single clause and say, this exact thing was the crime. It gives us God's own summary instead. You did not honor me as holy before the people. Whatever else was in Moses that day, that is the line God draws. And it should make every one of us who has ever spoken for God, taught for God, or stood in front of anyone in God's name go very quiet. Because notice what this means. The higher you stand, the smaller the margin. A person in the back of the crowd could have grumbled and struck 100 rocks, and we would never have heard about it. But Moses was not in the back of the crowd. Moses was the man God had chosen to show a nation what God was like. His life was a lesson the whole camp was reading. And so the same act that would be nothing in an ordinary man became everything in him. Leadership close to God is not a reward you get to relax into. It is a magnifying glass held over your every move. We are not guessing about the seriousness of it either, because Moses himself tells us how he took it. Later, in the book of Deuteronomy, he remembers begging God to lift the sentence. He pleaded, he says in chapter 3, verse 25, "Let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that fine hill country in Lebanon." And God's answer, in his own words in the very next verse, was this: "That is enough. Do not speak to me anymore about this matter." Even the greatest prophet in the Hebrew Scriptures, the man who spoke with God as a friend, asked for the sentence to be lifted, and was told gently but finally no. The first century historian Josephus, writing his History of the Jewish People, tells the story of Moses' end with real reverence, treating his death as the passing of the greatest leader the nation had ever known. And that is the ache of it. This is not the fall of a villain. This is the greatest of them all, told no. So the verdict is fixed. Moses will not cross. But what Moses does with that verdict in the years he has left is harder than parting any sea. And it starts with a long climb up a mountain alone. He climbs a mountain alone. An old man of 120 years, lungs burning, legs shaking on the rock, hauling himself up the slope of a peak called Nebo, to be shown with his own eyes the one thing he will never be allowed to touch. But that climb is the end of the story. Before it, there are years. Because here's what most people miss about Moses after the rock. He does not quit. The sentence is handed down at Kadesh. He knows he will die outside the land, and he keeps leading anyway. Book after book, he keeps teaching, keeps interceding for the same people who screamed at him, keeps writing down the law for a nation that will walk into a home he cannot enter. He pleads with God exactly once. We already heard the answer. That is enough. Do not speak to me any more about this matter. And after that, he never asks again. He just keeps working. Think about how hard that is. Imagine building a house with your own hands for 40 years. Every wall, every beam, knowing from the halfway point that you will never sleep a single night inside it. And you keep building anyway, straight and careful and honest, because the people who will live there are worth it. That is Moses from Kadesh to Nebo, a man finishing a task whose reward he has already been told he will not receive. He does one more thing before the mountain. He takes a young man named Joshua, lays his hands on him in front of the whole assembly, and gives him his own authority, so the nation will follow him. The leader who cannot go in commissions the leader who can. He hands the whole future to someone else on purpose, without bitterness, and then he turns toward the slope. And now we come to the climb. In the last chapter of Deuteronomy, Moses goes up from the plains of Moab to the top of Mount Nebo, to the peak of Pisgah, across from Jericho. This is real geography, a real ridge on the eastern edge of the Jordan Valley, and from its height on a clear day you can see for miles across the river into the land itself. And the Lord shows him the land, all of it. The text walks the view like a finger tracing a map in chapter 34, verse 1 and following. Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev in the south, and the whole region of the Jordan Valley, down to Jericho, the city of palms. Picture him up there. The wind on that old face. The text pauses to tell us in chapter 34, verse 7, that Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. He sees it all clearly. The green valley spread out below him, the palm trees of Jericho small in the distance, the river a bright thread across the middle of everything. 40 years of walking and it is all right there, close enough to see every field. And God says, in verse 4, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." You will not cross over. He is standing at the finish line. He can see it, and the line is drawn right at his feet. And there, on that mountain, Moses dies. The text says it plainly in verse 5. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. And then comes one of the strangest, tenderest verses in the whole Bible. Verse 6. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Read that carefully. He buried him. God buried him. There was no funeral procession, no tomb for pilgrims to visit, no monument. The same God who told this man no, who barred him from the land, personally laid him in the ground on the far side of the river and hid the grave so completely that no one has ever found it. Now here's the thing you cannot miss. You might read all of this and conclude that God was finished with Moses. Sentenced, refused, left to die on the wrong side of the Jordan, done with. But look at how the book ends just a few verses later in verse 10. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. The same God who set the boundary wrote the eulogy. He barred him from the land and buried him with his own hands and called him unmatched, all in the same chapter. That is not a God who was finished with him. That is a God who kept him close to the very end and past it. And there is one more thing on that mountain worth stopping for. Moses could not lead the people into the land. That door was closed to him. But the man who could, the man who would walk them across the Jordan and into their home, had a name, Joshua. In Hebrew, Yeshua. And that same name, centuries later in a small town called Bethlehem, would be spoken over a baby. The name means the Lord saves. The leader Moses could not be, the one who finally brings the people all the way home. God had promised to send from the very beginning. Moses got them to the river. Someone else had to carry them across. Moses died outside the land. But that rock, the one he struck, is not finished appearing in Scripture. It shows up one more time, centuries later, in the most unexpected place of all. Centuries later, a man named Paul sits down to write to a church in Corinth, and he reaches all the way back into that desert to make a point. He's reminding them that their ancestors all drank from a miraculous source in the wilderness. And then he says something that stops you cold. Writing about the rock that followed Israel through the desert, he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, and that rock was Christ. That rock was Christ. Go back now with that in your hands and look at the two rocks again, because the whole thing opens up. At the first rock, God said, strike it. And Moses struck it, and life poured out for a thirsty people. At the second rock, God said, do not strike it, only speak. And the reason the second command was different is the reason this matters at all. Because the rock that is struck once is never struck again. It is struck one time, and after that, you only have to speak to it, and the water still comes. Moses, lifting that staff a second time and bringing it down twice, broke the picture God was drawing. He struck what was only ever meant to be struck once. You do not have to understand every layer of that to feel the weight of it. The rock was struck one time so that a thirsty people could drink and live, and it never has to be struck again. From then on, you only speak. So let us gather up what we have walked through. A man with a staff at a rock in the 40th year, a command that changed from strike to speak, and a leader who ran the old instruction from memory and took the credit in a single small word. A verdict that named not his temper, but his failure to honor God as holy before a watching nation. A long climb up a lonely mountain, a whole promised land spread out and forbidden, and a grave dug by the hand of God, and underneath all of it, a rock, struck once, that turns out to have a name. This is not a story about a good man ruined by one bad day. It is not a warning to tiptoe around God as if he were waiting to catch you in a mistake. And it is not proof that God keeps a ledger and cancels your whole life over a single line. It is something better and stranger than any of those. So let me leave you with 3 things to carry out of it. The first is about God. The closer you stand to him, the more your life speaks for him. Moses was not punished harder than other people because God loved him less. He was held to that margin because he stood where the whole nation could see him. And a leader close to God is a magnifying glass, not a free pass. If you teach, if you lead, if anyone is watching how you live and learning something about God from it, that is not a burden to resent. It is a weight to carry carefully. The second is about failure. One failure, even a public one, even a costly one, does not erase 40 years of faithfulness. The sentence was real. Moses really did die outside the land, and the Bible does not soften that. But so was the honor. The same God who said no also dug the grave and wrote that no prophet like him has risen since. Your worst moment and God's tenderness are not enemies. They can both be true about you in the very same chapter. And the third is the one I most want you to keep. You may not reach every promised land you have been walking toward. Some doors close and stay closed, and no amount of pleading opens them. Moses learned that on his knees. But the God who set the boundary is the same God who climbed the mountain with him, showed him the whole land with his own voice, and would not let him die alone or lie in an unmarked grave untended. Your last chapter is not outside his reach. Even when it is outside the border, he does not abandon his servants at the edge of the river. He carries them home by another road. Moses got the people to the water's edge. Someone else carried them across. And the rock that gave them drink in the desert still gives, still pours, still stands, and never has to be struck again. If this opened up a story you thought you already knew, subscribe and send it to someone who has only ever heard that Moses lost his temper. There's so much more in this book than most of us were ever told. Thank you for walking through it with me. I will see you at the next one.